They built a world on lies. A world where your worth was measured not by your courage, your character, or your intellect, but by your bloodline. They called themselves the master race. They wrote it into law. They screamed it from podiums draped in red and black. And millions believed them. But history has a cruel sense of irony. And in courtrooms, prison cells, and the rubble of their own empire, the men who built that world of lies came face to face with the people they had called subhuman. What happened in those moments? Those raw, unscripted collisions between ideology and reality is one of the most revealing chapters of the entire war. And it's a chapter that doesn't get told often enough. Today, we're telling it. To understand what made these encounters so powerful, we first need to understand what Nazi racial ideology actually was, not as a distant abstraction, but as a lived, enforced reality that shaped every aspect of life in the Third Reich. The Nazi worldview was built on a rigid racial hierarchy. At the top, so they claimed, stood the Aryan people. Germanic, Nordic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pure, superior, destined to rule. Below them, in descending order of worth, sat all the other peoples of the world. And at the very bottom, stripped of humanity entirely, were Jews, Roma, Slavs, black people, and anyone else the Nazi machine decided was under mention. Subhumans. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was codified. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship. Forced labor, medical experiments, mass murder, all of it was given a legal and scientific veneer. The Nazis weren't just prejudiced. They had built an entire bureaucratic, intellectual, and military apparatus around the idea that certain human beings simply didn't deserve to exist. And the men who built this system, Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Haas, Albert Speer, Hans Frank, they believed it. Or at least, they acted as if they did. They gave speeches, they signed orders. They looked at human beings and saw cargo. But belief systems, no matter how fortified, sometimes crack. And crack they did, in ways that history recorded with remarkable precision. Let's begin in 1936. Berlin. The Olympic Games, Hitler's showcase to the world. Germany was supposed to demonstrate Aryan supremacy on the world stage. The propaganda machine had been running at full capacity for months. Joseph Goebbels personally supervised the messaging. This was going to be the moment the whole world saw what the master race could do. Then Jesse Owens walked into the stadium. James Cleveland Owens, the son of a sharecropper from Oakville, Alabama, raised in Cleveland, Ohio, proceeded to win 4 gold medals. 4. In the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100 relay. He didn't just win. He shattered world records. He made the so-called master race look ordinary by comparison. Now, the popular story goes that Hitler refused to shake Owens' hand, a deliberate snub. The truth is more complicated, and in some ways, more interesting. Hitler had actually been told by the International Olympic Committee to either congratulate all winners or none. So he stopped congratulating athletes publicly after the first day. But what is documented is that the Nazi leadership was furious. Privately, Goebbels' diaries record his humiliation. The regime's own reporters struggled to explain away what the whole world had just witnessed. And then something unexpected happened. A German long jumper named Louis Long, a man who embodied the Aryan ideal in every physical sense, befriended Owens. He gave him advice before the long jump competition. Advice that helped Owens qualify. The two men walked arm in arm around the track after the event, laughing, talking, in full view of the stadium. In full view of Adolf Hitler. Owens later said, "You can melt down all the medals and cups I have, and they wouldn't be a plating on the 24-karat friendship I felt for Louis Long at that moment." Louis Long was later killed on the Italian front in 1943. The friendship between these two men, one supposedly superior, one supposedly inferior, outlasted the ideology that tried to separate them. Jesse Owens returned to the United States to a complicated reception. President Franklin D. Roosevelt never sent him a telegram, never congratulated him. The racism of Jim Crow America was its own brutal reality. But in Berlin, in the very heart of Nazi Germany, a black American had stood in front of the world and made a lie of everything Hitler claimed to believe. Jump forward 9 years. The war is over. Germany is in ruins. And in a courtroom in Nuremberg, the same city where Hitler had once held his greatest rallies, the architects of the Holocaust are sitting in the dock. The Nuremberg trials ran from November 1945 to October 1946. 24 of the highest-ranking Nazis faced charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. And the team prosecuting them included men and women from nations the Nazis had specifically targeted, humiliated, and murdered. The chief American prosecutor was Robert H. Jackson. Among the Allied legal teams were Jewish attorneys who had fled Europe. Soviet prosecutors represented a nation that had lost over 20 million people to Nazi aggression. And serving as translators, guards, and support staff were black American soldiers, members of a military that, while still segregated, had just helped defeat the greatest army of racial supremacy the modern world had ever seen. Consider what that meant for the men in the dock. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and once the second most powerful man in the Reich. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. Albert Speer, the architect who had built Hitler's dreams in stone. Wilhelm Keitel, who had commanded Germany's armed forces. These men had presided over a system that classified entire peoples as biologically inferior. And now they sat under the authority, the legal, moral, and physical authority of a multiracial coalition of nations. Psychologist Gustav Gilbert was given extraordinary access to the defendants during the trials. His notes, later published as Nuremberg Diary, give us an intimate window into how these men actually behaved in confinement. What he recorded is both disturbing and revealing. Göring remained defiant for most of the trial, arrogant, manipulative, still performing the role of the great Nazi leader even in a prison cell. But even Göring had moments of fracture. When confronted with film footage of concentration camp liberation, images the Nazis themselves had tried to destroy, even he went quiet. Gilbert noted that several defendants looked away. Some wept. Some simply sat in silence. Julius Streicher, the publisher of the violently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, a man who had spent decades dehumanizing Jewish people in print, sat in the dock and was questioned, cross-examined, and judged partly by Jewish prosecutors and judges. He reportedly spewed racist abuse even during the trial itself, which only served to demonstrate, to everyone watching, the hollowness and desperation of the ideology he represented. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, the man who had overseen the murder of millions of Polish Jews and non-Jews alike. At Nuremberg, he broke down. He converted, or claimed to convert, to a fervent Catholicism. He confessed. He wept. Whether his remorse was genuine or a performance aimed at avoiding the gallows is debated by historians to this day. But what is not debated is this. The man who had once described his territory as free of Jews was now begging for mercy from the same international community he had tried to destroy. Here's a story that doesn't appear in most history textbooks. During World War II, approximately 1 million German soldiers were held as prisoners of war in the United States. And many of them, trained since childhood on Nazi racial doctrine, encountered for the first time in their lives something the ideology had told them was impossible. Black American soldiers guarding white German prisoners. The United States military in World War II was still segregated. The Tuskegee Airmen, The Buffalo Soldiers, the 92nd Infantry Division. These were units composed entirely of black men, most of them fighting for a country that denied them basic rights at home. Jim Crow laws were still in full effect. In some states, these same soldiers couldn't eat at the same restaurants as white Americans. But in POW camps across the American South and Midwest, the dynamic was stark and surreal. German prisoners, some of them hardened SS veterans, some of them ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, were now dependent on black guards for their daily welfare. Their food, their safety, their treatment, all of it came from men the Nazi ideology had labeled subhuman. Historian Matthias Reich documented many of these encounters in his research on German POWs in the United States. Some prisoners initially refused to take orders from black guards, citing their ideological training. Camp commanders had to deal with these incidents carefully, balancing military discipline with the absurd reality of Nazi racism playing out on American soil. Some German prisoners, particularly younger ones, or those who had been less deeply indoctrinated, genuinely seemed to revise their views. Isolated from the propaganda machine, actually interacting with black Americans as human beings for the first time, some began to question what they'd been taught. Memoirs from former German POWs occasionally record these moments of genuine recalibration. Others doubled down. Ideology is a powerful insulator against reality. Some prisoners simply couldn't reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been trained to believe, and chose their training. The human capacity for motivated reasoning under conditions of ideological investment is one of the darker lessons of this period. And then there were the encounters in the American South, where German POWs were sometimes treated better than black American civilians. There are documented cases of German prisoners being allowed to eat at lunch counters where black soldiers were refused service. The irony was not lost on the black soldiers who noticed. It wasn't lost on some of the German prisoners, either. Rudolf Haas was the commandant of Auschwitz. He oversaw the murder of more than 1 million people. When he was captured after the war by British soldiers who found him living under a false name on a farm, he was eventually handed over to Polish authorities and tried in Warsaw. During his imprisonment, Haas wrote his autobiography. It is one of the most chilling documents in human history, not because it is filled with rage or hatred, but because of how calm it is. Haas describes the mechanics of mass murder with the detachment of a factory manager discussing production quotas. He was efficient. He was proud of his efficiency. And he had genuinely convinced himself, it seems, that what he was doing was necessary. But in the courtroom in Warsaw, and in the weeks before his execution, something shifted. Haas came face to face, literally and figuratively, with the survivors. Polish prosecutors, Jewish witnesses, people who had somehow lived through what he had built. And for a man who had spent years reducing human beings to numbers in a ledger, this confrontation with their actual humanity was, by his own account, in his final notes, shattering. He was hanged at Auschwitz in April 1947, on a gallows erected near the crematoria where he had sent over 1 million people to their deaths. The symbolism was intentional. Polish authorities wanted the location to be unmistakable. The people he had once called inferior were the ones who tried him, convicted him, and chose the location of his death. History had answered the ideology in the most direct way possible. In April and May of 1945, Allied forces liberated the Nazi concentration camps. What they found shattered even battle-hardened soldiers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered as many American officers and soldiers as possible to tour the camps. He also ordered German civilians from nearby towns to be brought in, to see what had been done in their name. But here is what textbooks often leave out. Among the liberating forces were Jewish soldiers who had fled Europe before the war. Men who had escaped Nazi persecution, joined the Allied armies, and were now returning, in uniform, armed, victorious, to the camps where their families had been sent. Imagine what that meant. These were men the Nazi state had formally declared to be racially inferior, biologically dangerous, unfit to exist. And now they were the ones holding the rifles. They were the ones opening the gates. In some cases, surviving camp guards and SS personnel were taken prisoner by these very soldiers. The encounters were sometimes violent, understandably so, and Allied commanders struggled to maintain order in those first chaotic hours of liberation. But what strikes historians most who have studied the testimonies from both sides is how often, in those moments, the Nazi ideology simply collapsed under the weight of reality. Guards who had brutalized prisoners for years suddenly became cooperative, compliant, afraid. Men who had defined their entire identities around racial dominance found themselves powerless, terrified, begging. The ideology had promised them superiority. What it delivered, in the end, was a cell. Albert Speer is one of the most complicated figures to emerge from the Nazi era. Hitler's personal architect, the Minister of Armaments, the man who kept the German war machine running with staggering efficiency, Speer always insisted he did not know about the Holocaust. He maintained this position throughout the Nuremberg trials, throughout his 20-year prison sentence, and for the rest of his life. Historians debate it fiercely. The evidence strongly suggests he was lying. But what is fascinating about Speer is not whether he knew. Most serious historians believe he did, but how he managed the confrontation with that knowledge at Nuremberg. Because unlike Göring, unlike Streicher, unlike Keitel, Speer expressed remorse. He accepted collective responsibility. He positioned himself as the man who had opposed Hitler in the final months of the war. And this performance, whether genuine or calculated, likely saved him from the gallows. He received 20 years. Göring was sentenced to death. What makes Speer's story relevant to our theme today is this. The men who judged him, who decided whether he lived or died, were from the nations and peoples his machinery had tried to destroy. Jewish attorneys contributed to his prosecution. Soviet judges sat on the bench. Slavic peoples, whom the Nazis had officially classified as subhuman, now held the pen that would write his fate. The irony is almost too stark to put into words. Heinrich Himmler was perhaps the single most important architect of Nazi racial policy. As head of the SS and overseer of the concentration camp system, he was personally responsible for the implementation of the Holocaust. He believed, deeply, obsessively, in racial science. He sponsored archaeological expeditions searching for proof of Aryan origins. He built the SS as a racial elite. He wrote about bloodlines and genetics with the fervor of a true believer. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, Himmler tried to flee. He disguised himself with an eye patch and false papers, hoping to pass as an ordinary German soldier. He was captured by a British patrol near Nuremberg. The man who had spent his career classifying and categorizing human beings by racial worth was now just another prisoner in British custody. His captors included men from across the British Empire, Indians, Africans, West Indians, soldiers from the very peoples Himmler's ideology had placed near the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule 2 days after his capture, killing himself before he could be brought to trial. Some historians interpret this as an act of cowardice. Others see it as the final, desperate assertion of control from a man who could not bear to sit in a courtroom and be judged by people his ideology had condemned. Either way, he escaped the reckoning that the Nuremberg defendants faced. But he did not escape the collapse of everything he had built. Let's talk about the sky for a moment. The Tuskegee Airmen, officially the 332nd Fighter Group and 477th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces, were the first African-American military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces. They flew P-51 Mustangs, escorted bombers deep into Germany, and engaged the Luftwaffe in combat. The Luftwaffe was, by any measure, one of the most elite air forces in history. Its pilots were highly trained, battle-hardened, and had spent years absorbing Nazi ideology about racial hierarchy. And then they encountered the Red Tails, as the Tuskegee Airmen were known, for the distinctive red paint on their aircraft tails, in the skies over Europe. What happened was not what Nazi ideology predicted. The Tuskegee Airmen compiled an extraordinary combat record. They flew over 15,000 individual sorties. They destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft. They were awarded hundreds of military decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross. There is a story, disputed by some historians but persistent in the oral tradition, that Luftwaffe pilots eventually began to recognize the Red Tails and specifically tried to avoid engaging them. Whether or not the details are precisely accurate, the symbolic truth is undeniable. Black American pilots, flying for a country that still denied them equal rights, were matching and defeating the air force of the self-proclaimed master race. When some captured Luftwaffe pilots were informed that the pilots they had been fighting, or trying to avoid, were Black Americans, the reactions reportedly ranged from genuine disbelief to sullen silence. The ideology had no framework for this. It simply did not compute. So what do we make of all this? What do these moments, in the stadium, in the courtroom, in the POW camp, in the sky, actually tell us? The first thing they tell us is something about the nature of ideology itself. Ideology, when built on a lie, requires constant maintenance. It requires that the people the lie is about never be allowed to speak, to compete, to exist in full humanity. The moment Jesse Owens ran, the moment Jewish prosecutors stood up in Nuremberg, the moment black soldiers opened the gates of the camps, the lie was not just challenged. It was demonstrated to be a lie, in real time, in front of witnesses. The second thing these moments tell us is about human resilience. The people the Nazis tried to erase, the Jewish communities of Europe, the black soldiers fighting a segregated army, the Roma, the Slavic peoples, the political prisoners, they endured. Some of them were broken. Too many were murdered. But those who survived, and those who were never captured, went on to do something remarkable. They faced their oppressors as equals. As more than equals. The third thing these moments tell us is perhaps the most uncomfortable. Ideology is not easily broken by evidence alone. Some of the Nazi defendants at Nuremberg died still believing in racial hierarchy. Some German POWs returned to Germany and never revised their worldview. The fact that reality contradicted the ideology did not automatically dismantle it. It took generations of education, confrontation, and reckoning. A reckoning Germany has been more honest about than most nations, to begin to undo what 12 years of Nazi rule had built. And the fourth thing, the most human thing, is what we see in moments like Lou's long walking arm in arm with Jesse Owens. In black soldiers treating German prisoners with the dignity the ideology denied. In the Jewish attorneys at Nuremberg who prosecuted carefully, methodically, within the rule of law, rather than simply seeking revenge. There is something in these moments about the possibility of choosing a different path, about the stubborn persistence of human decency. In October 1946, after nearly a year of testimony, the verdicts at Nuremberg were read. 12 men were sentenced to death. 7 received prison sentences. 3 were acquitted. It was imperfect justice. Some would say grossly inadequate given the scale of what had been done. But it was justice. And it was administered by representatives of nations and peoples the Nazi regime had targeted for destruction. Göring cheated the gallows by swallowing cyanide the night before his scheduled execution. The rest were hanged. Their bodies were photographed and the photographs were distributed, partly as evidence, partly as a deliberate message. The ideology of racial superiority had brought its architects to a room where they were judged, weighed, and found catastrophically wanting. Jesse Owens lived until 1980. He returned to Germany multiple times after the war, was celebrated there, and maintained until his death that the German public had treated him with respect. The man who had shattered the mythology of the master race in the summer of 1936 became, in a deeply meaningful way, a symbol of something the Nazis could never have imagined, a friendship between peoples that survived the war that had tried to make enemies of everyone. The Tuskegee Airmen were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007, 62 years after the war ended. Many of them were still alive to receive it. Many were not. The concentration camp survivors who testified at Nuremberg, who watched their tormentors sit in the dock, who saw them sentenced. Many of them said afterward that it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was something. A line drawn. A statement made by civilization to those who had tried to destroy it. This will not be allowed to stand. The men who built the Third Reich believed, with absolute conviction, that certain human beings were inferior. History does not deliver many verdicts cleanly. But on this one, history was unambiguous. They were wrong. Catastrophically, murderously, irredeemably wrong. And the men they called inferior were the ones who proved it.